There is something unusual about certain nights. They arrive looking ordinary, carrying the same quiet darkness, the same distant stars, the same peaceful silence everyone else believes they understand. Yet sometimes, hidden beneath that silence, an entire world begins to change inside a single heart. Last night was one of those nights. It was the kind of night that leaves no evidence behind except tired eyes, restless thoughts, and a feeling that refuses to disappear with the morning. If this fictional story has found you today, stay with it for a little while, because what happened was not loud, dramatic, or impossible to ignore. It happened quietly, the way the most meaningful moments often do. Long after the lights had gone out and the streets had become empty, someone lay awake staring at the ceiling, hoping that closing their eyes would finally bring peace. Instead, every attempt to sleep carried them back toward the same memories they had spent so long trying to escape. They counted the passing minutes. They turned from one side to the other. They reached for distractions that never seemed to work. But every road their thoughts followed somehow led back to you. Not because fate demanded it, not because magic forced it, but because some people leave behind memories that become impossible to silence. The strange part was that nothing extraordinary had happened that day. There had been no message, no unexpected phone call, no dramatic reunion, no life-changing announcement. The world had continued exactly as it always had. Yet somewhere deep inside, something shifted without asking permission. It began with a single memory, small enough to ignore. Then another followed. Soon those memories linked together like pages from a forgotten journal, each one reminding them of conversations they believed they had already buried beneath time. They remembered the first moment they realized your presence felt different from everyone else's. They remembered the comfort found in ordinary conversations, the way simple moments somehow carried more meaning than grand gestures ever could. They remembered laughter that arrived naturally instead of being forced, silence that never felt uncomfortable, and the quiet feeling of being understood without needing to explain every thought. Those were not spectacular memories. They were gentle ones. Perhaps that was exactly why they refused to disappear. As midnight quietly slipped into the early hours of the morning, they finally admitted something they had hidden even from themselves. Life had moved forward, but part of their heart had remained standing in the same place, patiently waiting for answers it never received. That realization was not painful because it revealed weakness. It was painful because it revealed honesty. For months they had convinced themselves that moving on meant forgetting. Last night they discovered those were never the same thing. Forgetting is something the mind attempts. Understanding is something the heart reaches only after enough time has passed. And understanding arrived all at once, quietly, while the rest of the world slept. They began wondering how many moments had been misunderstood simply because fear spoke louder than honesty. How many opportunities had disappeared because neither person knew how to express what truly mattered. They smiled sadly at that thought, realizing how often people protect themselves so carefully that they accidentally hide the very feelings they hope someone else will notice. Outside, the wind gently moved through empty streets. A clock somewhere in the distance marked another passing hour. Morning was getting closer, yet sleep remained impossibly far away. Instead of fighting the memories, they finally allowed them to stay. They replayed old conversations, searching for details they had overlooked. They remembered expressions, pauses, unfinished sentences, moments that once seemed ordinary but now appeared filled with meaning. Funny how time changes perspective. The same memory can feel completely different years later, not because the memory changed, but because the person remembering finally did. As dawn slowly approached, exhaustion settled over them, yet something inside felt lighter than it had in a very long time. Nothing around them had changed. The room looked exactly the same. The silence remained. The unanswered questions still existed. Yet one important thing was different. They were no longer running from their own feelings. Sometimes the greatest change begins with nothing more than one sleepless night and the courage to stop pretending that certain memories no longer matter. And perhaps that is why mornings after restless nights often feel different. They do not always bring solutions. They simply bring clarity, and clarity has a quiet way of changing everything that comes next. Morning arrived without asking whether they had slept, yet it carried something the night had been quietly preparing all along. Sunlight slowly slipped through the window, touching the room with a warmth that felt unfamiliar after so many restless hours. They closed their eyes for only a moment, not because they were finally tired enough to sleep, but because they wanted to hold on to the strange clarity the night had given them. It is remarkable how silence can reveal truths that noise keeps hidden. During the day, people become experts at distracting themselves. They answer messages, complete responsibilities, smile at familiar faces, and convince everyone that life is moving exactly as it should. Yet beneath those ordinary routines, there are thoughts waiting patiently for the moment everything becomes quiet again. Last night, those thoughts had finally found their voice. They realized they had spent far too much time searching for certainty when life had only ever offered moments. Some moments were joyful, others confusing, and a few became unforgettable without anyone noticing at the time. They remembered a conversation that had once seemed insignificant. A few simple words exchanged without ceremony, yet now those same words carried a meaning they had completely missed. They wondered how many beautiful things people lose simply because they expect life to announce them loudly. The truth is, the most meaningful changes rarely arrive with celebration. They appear gently, almost invisibly, asking only that someone is paying close enough attention to notice. As the hours passed, they tried to continue with their normal routine, but every ordinary task seemed to carry an unexpected reminder. A familiar song drifted through the air, and suddenly another memory returned. A passing stranger smiled in a way that reminded them of someone they once knew. Even the quiet breeze outside felt strangely familiar, as though the world itself had become a collection of tiny echoes leading back toward unfinished emotions. They were not searching for signs. They were simply discovering that memories have a remarkable way of hiding inside ordinary places. For the first time, they stopped asking themselves whether remembering was a mistake. Instead, they asked a different question. What if some memories remain alive because they still have something important to teach us? That thought changed everything. Instead of treating the past like an enemy, they began looking at it with gratitude. Every joyful conversation had shaped them. Every misunderstanding had taught patience. Every goodbye had revealed the value of honesty. Even the moments they wished had never happened had quietly transformed them into someone capable of understanding love with greater kindness and greater humility. Looking back no longer felt like becoming trapped. It felt like finally understanding the journey that had brought them here. They smiled softly, realizing that healing does not always mean forgetting someone. Sometimes healing means remembering them without allowing regret to control the future. That realization settled gently inside their heart like sunlight filling a room that had remained dark for far too long. Later that afternoon, they found themselves sitting quietly, watching the world continue exactly as it always had. Children laughed in the distance. Birds crossed the open sky without hesitation. Cars passed along familiar roads. Nothing around them appeared extraordinary, yet everything somehow felt different because their perspective had changed. The world had not become more beautiful overnight. They had simply become more willing to notice its quiet beauty. That single sleepless night had not answered every question, but it had awakened something far more valuable. It had reminded them that honesty with oneself is often the first step toward every meaningful beginning. They understood that life cannot be rewritten, but it can always be understood differently. And sometimes, understanding is enough to change the direction of everything that follows. As evening slowly returned, they no longer feared the coming darkness. The night had stopped feeling like an enemy. Instead, it had become a quiet companion, reminding them that even the longest hours of uncertainty eventually give way to another sunrise. They looked toward the fading light outside the window and allowed themselves to hope again, not because they expected miracles, but because hope itself is often the quiet decision to believe that tomorrow can become better than yesterday. Somewhere beyond the horizon, another night was preparing to arrive. It would carry new thoughts, new reflections, and perhaps new answers, but this time they would meet it differently. They would no longer run from silence. They would listen to it. Because sometimes the greatest transformation begins with nothing more than one sleepless night, one honest heart, and the courage to face emotions that had waited patiently to be understood all along. As another evening slowly unfolded, they noticed something they had never paid attention to before. The world becomes quieter long before the sun completely disappears. Conversations grow softer, footsteps become fewer, and even the wind seems to move with greater patience. It was during that quiet hour that they found themselves returning to the same place by the window where the previous night had begun. The room looked no different, yet they did. Sometimes people spend years believing that change must come from the outside, when in reality the most important transformations happen where no one else can see them. They rested their hands gently against the cool glass and watched as light slowly appeared across the distance. Every window held another story. Every passing stranger carried another unseen chapter. It reminded them that every heart is quietly fighting battles the world never notices. That thought filled them with unexpected compassion, not only for themselves but for everyone they had misunderstood along the way. Perhaps everyone has a night they never speak about. A night when sleep refuses to come because the heart has finally decided it can no longer hide behind routine. They realized that the previous night had not been about losing sleep at all. It had been about gaining clarity. Every restless hour had carefully removed another layer of confusion until only the truth remained. They remembered how desperately they had once searched for certainty in other people. They wanted perfect answers, perfect timing, perfect reassurance. Yet none of those things had ever truly existed. Life had always moved through uncertainty, asking people to take small steps before the entire path became visible. Looking back, they smiled at how often fear had disguised itself as caution. There were words they had chosen not to speak because the future seemed uncertain. There were opportunities they quietly allowed to disappear because waiting felt safer than risking disappointment. But now another understanding quietly settled within them. Regret rarely comes from the chances we take with kindness. More often, it grows from the moments when fear convinces us to remain silent even though the heart already knows what it wishes it had said. That realization stayed with them as darkness slowly returned. The stars began appearing one by one, not all at once, but patiently, reminding them that even the sky reveals its beauty gradually. They found comfort in that thought. Perhaps healing follows the same rhythm. Perhaps nobody is expected to understand everything in a single moment. Perhaps the heart simply learns one honest lesson at a time until the weight it has carried for so long finally becomes lighter. They closed their eyes and allowed themselves to remember without resistance. The memories no longer arrived like sharp waves crashing against the shore. They came gently now, like pages turning inside an old book whose story no longer demanded tears but deserved gratitude. Every conversation they replayed carried a lesson they had once overlooked. Every silence revealed emotions that words had failed to express. It became clear that people often believe communication begins with speaking, when in truth it begins with listening. They wished they had listened more carefully, not only to another person, but also to themselves. There had been moments when their own heart quietly warned them not to let fear make decisions, yet they had ignored that gentle voice because doubt always seemed louder. Now they understood that wisdom rarely shouts. It whispers. It waits patiently beneath every distraction until someone finally becomes quiet enough to hear it. Hours passed almost unnoticed. Unlike the previous night, they were no longer fighting against the silence. They welcomed it. They understood that silence was never empty. It was simply filled with everything people avoid hearing during busy days. And in that silence they discovered something unexpected. Hope had quietly returned. Not the fragile hope that depends upon perfect outcomes, but the steady hope that grows whenever someone chooses honesty over fear. Nothing outside the room had changed. The same streets remained. The same sky stretched above the same city. Yet inside, something impossible to measure had shifted forever. They no longer carried the unbearable pressure of needing to rewrite the past. Instead, they carried a quiet determination to meet the future differently. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they wanted to arrive with openness instead of hesitation, with gratitude instead of regret, with courage instead of endless questions. Somewhere in the distance, the first light of another dawn slowly prepared itself beyond the horizon, unseen but steadily approaching. It reminded them that every sunrise begins while the world is still surrounded by darkness. Change often begins the same way. Long before anyone notices it, long before circumstances appear different, something deep within the heart has already started becoming new. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden inside ordinary nights. Not that they erase every wound or answer every question, but that they gently teach a weary soul that even after hours of uncertainty, another morning always finds its way back, carrying another opportunity to choose kindness, to choose honesty, and to continue becoming the person they were quietly growing into all along. The following evening arrived with a quiet confidence, almost as if the world already knew something they were only beginning to understand. Nothing around them demanded attention. The streets followed their familiar rhythm, distant conversations faded into the background, and the sky slowly traded its golden light for deep shades of blue. Yet inside their heart, everything felt different. The questions that had once raced endlessly through their mind no longer carried the same urgency. They had not disappeared completely, but they had become quieter, softer, almost willing to wait. That surprised them more than anything else. They had spent so much of their life believing peace could only arrive after every mystery had been solved, yet now they discovered that peace sometimes arrives first, allowing the answers to appear in their own time. Sitting alone with their thoughts no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like meeting a version of themselves they had ignored for far too long. They remembered the countless days spent rushing from one responsibility to another, convincing themselves that staying busy meant moving forward. Now they understood that movement and progress are not always the same thing. A person can travel great distances while remaining emotionally unchanged, and another can remain in the same place while quietly transforming into someone entirely new. That realization settled deeply within them. They smiled gently, realizing that the sleepless night had not taken anything away. Instead, it had revealed everything they had overlooked while trying so hard to protect themselves from disappointment. They thought about how often people wait for extraordinary moments to change their lives, never noticing that life usually changes through ordinary moments repeated with greater awareness. A simple conversation remembered differently. A familiar place viewed through kinder eyes. A quiet evening that offers enough silence for hidden emotions to finally breathe. Those were the moments shaping them now. As darkness slowly covered the sky once again, they stepped outside for a short walk. The cool evening air carried the scent of rain somewhere in the distance, and every breath seemed to clear another layer of uncertainty from their thoughts. They watched strangers pass one another without knowing the invisible stories each person carried. Some smiled while hiding sadness. Others appeared serious while quietly protecting hope. It reminded them that appearances rarely tell the whole story. Hearts often speak a language that cannot be seen from the outside. That understanding filled them with unexpected patience. They no longer wished to judge moments too quickly. They no longer wanted to assume that silence always meant absence or that distance always meant forgetting. Life had already taught them that emotions often continue growing long after words have stopped. Reaching a small park, they sat on an empty bench beneath a tree whose leaves moved gently in the evening breeze. There was nothing remarkable about the place, and perhaps that was exactly why it felt comforting. No memories demanded attention there. No expectations waited in the shadows. It was simply a quiet place where they could breathe without pretending to be stronger than they felt. Looking toward the stars slowly appearing overhead, they reflected on how every difficult season had quietly left behind an unexpected gift. Disappointment had taught resilience. Uncertainty had taught patience. Loss had taught gratitude for moments that once seemed ordinary. Even sleepless nights had taught the value of listening to a heart that had spent far too long whispering beneath the noise of everyday life. They realized that healing is rarely a single event. It is a collection of tiny decisions repeated over and over again. Choosing honesty instead of denial. Choosing compassion instead of blame. Choosing hope instead of surrender. None of those choices looked dramatic from the outside, yet together they slowly changed everything. As the night grew deeper, they stood and began walking home, noticing that the same street somehow felt lighter than before. Nothing physical had changed. The buildings stood where they always had. The lights glowed with familiar warmth. Yet the weight they had carried through those streets for so long no longer rested so heavily upon their shoulders. They finally understood that some burdens disappear not because circumstances improve, but because the heart learns a gentler way to carry them. When they reached home, they paused before turning on the lights. The quiet room greeted them with the same stillness that had once felt overwhelming, but now it felt peaceful. They poured themselves a warm drink, sat beside the window once more, and watched the moon reflect softly across the night. This time there was no struggle against the silence. No desperate attempt to outrun old memories. Instead, they welcomed every thought with calm acceptance, knowing that memories lose their power to wound when they are met with understanding rather than fear. Before finally preparing for sleep, they whispered a simple promise to themselves. They would no longer allow yesterday to steal the beauty waiting inside tomorrow. They would carry every lesson forward without carrying every regret. Whatever the future held, they wanted to meet it with an open heart, steady courage, and quiet gratitude for the journey that had shaped them into who they were becoming. As they closed their eyes, the room remained silent, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of possibility, like the calm beginning of a new chapter whose most meaningful pages had not yet been written. The following morning arrived with a softness they had almost forgotten existed. For the first time in what felt like countless days, they did not rush to escape their own thoughts. They simply sat quietly, allowing the early light to fill the room while the world slowly awakened outside. There was something different about the silence now. It no longer felt heavy. It no longer carried the sharp edges of uncertainty. Instead, it felt like a gentle reminder that not every answer needs to arrive immediately. Some truths unfold little by little, revealing themselves only when the heart becomes patient enough to receive them. As they looked out the window, they noticed ordinary things they had overlooked for so long. A child laughing without worrying about tomorrow. An elderly couple walking side by side without saying very much, yet somehow understanding everything. Birds crossing the open sky with complete trust that the wind would carry them where they needed to go. Those simple moments stirred something deep within them. They realized that life had never stopped offering beauty. They had simply become too occupied with searching for certainty to notice it. The previous sleepless night had changed more than their emotions. It had quietly changed the way they looked at the world. Every memory that once felt like a burden had slowly begun transforming into a lesson. Every unanswered question had become an invitation to grow rather than another reason to remain afraid. They found themselves thinking less about what could have happened and more about what could still become possible if they chose courage over hesitation. That thought stayed with them throughout the day. Every conversation felt more meaningful because they listened more carefully. Every smile seemed more genuine because they finally understood how much effort it sometimes takes for another person to smile at all. Even moments of silence carried a strange comfort, reminding them that peace is not the absence of emotion but the willingness to sit with emotion without allowing it to control every decision. As evening approached once again, they returned to the same quiet place where they had spent so much time reflecting. The familiar bench beneath the old tree welcomed them like an old friend. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of fresh rain that had fallen somewhere nearby. They closed their eyes for a brief moment and allowed themselves to breathe deeply. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no extraordinary signs, no impossible coincidences, no sudden miracles. Yet something inside them continued changing with every slow breath. They understood that real transformation rarely announces itself. It grows quietly beneath the surface, like roots stretching deeper before anyone notices new branches reaching toward the sky. Sitting there, they remembered one particular conversation from long ago. At the time, it had seemed completely ordinary, almost forgettable. But now they understood that hidden within those few simple words had been kindness they were too distracted to appreciate. They smiled gently, realizing that people often recognize the value of ordinary moments only after enough time has passed. That realization did not fill them with regret. Instead, it filled them with gratitude. Gratitude that those memories still existed. Gratitude that life had allowed them to experience something genuine, even if they had not fully understood it in the moment. Looking toward the horizon, they watched as the last light of day slowly disappeared behind distant buildings. The sky changed colors so gradually that it became impossible to identify the exact moment afternoon became evening. It reminded them that healing happens the same way. There is rarely one single instant when pain disappears. Instead, it quietly fades while hope slowly takes its place until one day a person realizes they are breathing more freely than before. That understanding brought unexpected peace. They no longer measured progress by dramatic breakthroughs. They measured it by smaller things. By how often they smiled without forcing it. By how little fear controlled their decisions. By how easily they could remember the past without becoming trapped inside it. Those quiet victories felt more meaningful than anything they had once believed success looked like. As darkness settled over the city once again, they stood from the bench and began walking home beneath a sky filled with countless distant stars. Every step felt lighter than the last, not because the journey had become easier, but because they were no longer carrying unnecessary weight. They had stopped demanding certainty from tomorrow. They had stopped punishing themselves for yesterday. They had finally learned to meet the present moment exactly as it was, imperfect yet beautiful in ways they had never noticed before. Reaching home, they paused at the doorway and looked back toward the quiet street. Somewhere beyond the horizon another story was beginning for someone else, another heart searching for answers, another person learning that sleepless nights sometimes reveal the deepest truths about who we are becoming. They smiled softly, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, because they finally understood that the most important destination had never been another place or another person. It had always been this quiet moment of honesty, where fear no longer spoke louder than hope, where memories no longer overshadowed possibility, and where tomorrow finally felt like something to welcome instead of something to fear. With that gentle realization resting peacefully within their heart, they turned off the lights, closed their eyes, and allowed the night to arrive once more, no longer as an enemy filled with unanswered questions, but as a quiet companion carrying the promise that every dawn begins long before the first ray of sunlight ever reaches the sky. The final night arrived without announcing itself, just as every important ending quietly becomes the beginning of something new. Nothing in the world seemed different, yet everything inside them carried a calm they had never known before. The same moon hung above the quiet streets, the same breeze drifted through the trees, and the same stars watched over the sleeping city, but their heart no longer searched for answers hidden in the darkness. Instead, it carried a gentle certainty that some journeys are never meant to end with perfect explanations. They are meant to end with understanding. Standing once again beside the familiar window where this story had first begun, they looked into the distance and smiled, not because every wish had come true, but because they had finally stopped measuring happiness by outcomes they could never control. They understood now that every sleepless hour had quietly guided them toward this single moment of clarity. They remembered the fear that once convinced them to hide their feelings, the hesitation that made silence seem safer than honesty, and the endless questions that had followed them through so many ordinary days. Looking back, none of those moments felt wasted anymore. Every uncertainty had prepared them for wisdom. Every disappointment had taught compassion. Every quiet goodbye had revealed the extraordinary value of every simple hello that life had once placed before them. They closed their eyes and allowed every memory to pass gently through their mind one final time, not holding on to any of them, not pushing any of them away, simply letting them exist as part of the story that had shaped them. There was no anger left, no blame, no desperate longing to rewrite yesterday. Only gratitude remained. Gratitude for every smile that had once brightened an ordinary afternoon, for every conversation that had offered comfort during difficult seasons, for every lesson hidden inside moments they had once mistaken for failures. They realized that life had never been asking them to become fearless. It had only been asking them to become honest. Honest enough to admit what mattered. Honest enough to forgive themselves for what they did not know then. Honest enough to believe that every chapter, even the painful ones, had quietly carried them toward becoming someone kinder, stronger, and more patient than they had ever imagined. Outside, the first light of dawn slowly began touching the horizon. The darkness did not disappear all at once. It surrendered little by little, making room for another morning exactly as it always had. Watching that slow transformation reminded them that healing follows the same gentle rhythm. It does not rush. It does not demand perfection. It simply continues. One quiet sunrise after another, until the heart finally realizes it is no longer carrying the same weight it once believed would remain forever. They took one long breath and whispered a promise that only the morning could hear. From this day forward, they would choose courage instead of hesitation, kindness instead of resentment, gratitude instead of regret. They would stop waiting for extraordinary moments before allowing themselves to appreciate ordinary life. They would notice the laughter shared over simple conversations, the warmth of sunlight across familiar places, the comfort of silence that no longer needed to be filled with fear. Most of all, they would remember that one restless night had not changed their destiny through magic or mystery. It had changed them because it gave them the courage to listen to their own heart without running away. That was the real turning point. Not the sleepless hours themselves, but the honesty they revealed. As the sun rose higher, the room slowly filled with golden light, washing away the last traces of the night that had once felt endless. They smiled with quiet confidence, stepped away from the window, and opened the door to greet the new day. Behind them remained the memories that had shaped their journey. Ahead of them waited countless moments still unwritten, each carrying the possibility of unexpected joy, meaningful conversations, quiet healing, and new beginnings that could never have existed without everything they had already lived through. They no longer feared the future because they had finally made peace with the past. Every ending they once mourned had quietly prepared them for this beginning. Every unanswered question had slowly become a lesson. Every restless night had patiently carried them toward a morning where hope no longer felt fragile, but steady and real. And so the story came to its gentle conclusion, not with dramatic revelations or impossible promises, but with something far more lasting, the quiet understanding that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break, but the ones that continue choosing hope, compassion, and honesty every time a new sunrise appears. With that final thought resting peacefully within them, they walked forward into the light, leaving behind fear, carrying only gratitude, and welcoming whatever tomorrow might bring with a heart that had finally learned how to be at peace. As the days quietly continued, they stopped searching for the moment that would change everything because they finally understood that the moment had already arrived without making any noise. It had arrived on a sleepless night when the world believed nothing unusual was happening, yet an entire heart was learning how to become free. Looking back, they could hardly recognize the person who had once been afraid of silence. That version of themselves believed every unanswered question was a burden and every uncertain tomorrow was something to fear. Now they knew something entirely different. Uncertainty was not the enemy. It was the space where hope quietly learned how to grow. Every difficult memory that had once demanded tears now carried wisdom instead. Every mistake they had replayed 1,000 times had slowly transformed into compassion for the person they used to be. They no longer wished to erase any chapter of their journey because without those chapters they would never have become capable of appreciating the peace that now rested within them. One quiet evening they returned once more to the place where so many of their thoughts had unfolded. The familiar bench remained beneath the old tree, the breeze still moved gently through its branches, and the sky stretched endlessly above them just as it always had. Yet everything felt wonderfully different because they were no longer waiting for life to give them permission to be happy. They smiled as children laughed in the distance, as birds crossed the fading sky, and as strangers walked past carrying stories they would never know. For the first time, they felt deeply connected to the ordinary beauty surrounding them. They realized that life had always been offering quiet miracles. A sunrise that arrived without asking for applause. A conversation that healed someone without either person realizing it. A simple act of kindness that continued echoing long after it was forgotten. They had spent too much of their life searching for extraordinary moments while overlooking the extraordinary beauty hidden inside ordinary days. That realization filled them with a gratitude so deep that words could hardly contain it. They closed their eyes and remembered the sleepless night that had started everything. At the time it had felt endless, almost unbearable, but now they understood that it had never been sent to punish them. It had been inviting them to stop running from themselves. It had gently removed every distraction until only honesty remained. That honesty became the beginning of healing. Healing became the beginning of peace. Peace became the beginning of hope. And hope quietly became the beginning of an entirely new life. They whispered a quiet thank you, not to any single moment, but to the entire journey that had shaped them. They were thankful for the joy that had taught them how beautiful life could be. They were thankful for disappointment because it had taught patience. They were thankful for uncertainty because it had taught courage. Most of all, they were thankful that they had finally discovered a truth that would remain with them forever. The heart becomes strongest not when it never feels pain, but when it learns that pain does not have to become its permanent home. Standing from the bench, they looked toward the horizon where the final light of evening slowly disappeared. There was no sadness in watching the day end because they understood every ending quietly prepares the world for another beginning. Tomorrow would arrive with its own opportunities, its own conversations, its own quiet moments waiting to be noticed. They promised themselves they would never again become too busy to appreciate them. They would speak with kindness before pride had the chance to interrupt. They would listen before making assumptions. They would choose courage whenever fear suggested remaining silent. They would remember that genuine happiness is built through countless small decisions repeated every single day. As they walked home beneath a sky filled with stars, they felt lighter than they had in years. The weight they had carried had not disappeared because someone else removed it. It disappeared because they finally chose to set it down themselves. That simple decision changed everything. Reaching home, they paused one final time beside the same window where this story had begun. The moon shone softly across the quiet streets, but tonight it no longer reminded them of loneliness. It reminded them of constancy. Night would always return, just as morning always followed. Seasons would change. People would come and go. Memories would continue living gently within the heart. Yet none of those things needed to be feared anymore. They had learned that peace is not found by controlling tomorrow. Peace is found by accepting today with honesty, gratitude, and quiet confidence. They smiled one last time, switched off the light, and closed their eyes. This time sleep arrived gently, not because every mystery had been solved, but because they no longer needed every mystery to be solved before allowing themselves to rest. Outside, another dawn patiently waited beyond the horizon, carrying possibilities still unseen. Inside, their heart was finally still. The restless nights had become cherished memories, the unanswered questions had become gentle lessons, and the uncertain road ahead had become an invitation instead of a fear. With calm breathing and a peaceful smile, they stepped into tomorrow knowing that the greatest transformation had never been waiting somewhere far away. It had quietly happened within them all along. And that is how the story truly ends, not with a miracle that changed the world overnight, but with a quiet heart that finally discovered its own strength, embraced its own truth, and walked confidently toward every new sunrise believing that hope, kindness, and honesty would always be enough to guide the way forward.